Welcome to Making Moves, a podcast presented by the Center for Sport and Social Justice at Cal State University, East Bay. Today's episode features a conversation on professional women's sports, featuring an interview with guests Dr. Rachel Allison and Dr. Letisha Brown, with host Jill Nelson. This is McKenna Duda, your podcast producer and host. I'm a Cal State East Bay kinesiology graduate, former collegiate, now recreational runner, and a personal trainer. I'm located in Dallas, Texas, where you can catch me playing sand volleyball, hiking any and every hill I can find, or studying to encourage those around me to pursue a life of adventure, service, and vitality. Here, we'd like to serve our audience by educating and also inspiring y'all to feel empowered through sport and social justice. All athletes, sports fans, and social justice advocates are welcome. It's time to be mindful. Within this portion of the pod, we intentionally consider a thought or topic. When engaged in a rigorous schedule, you can improve your performance. Incorporating breaks from continuous periods of work can allow the mind to recharge and function better post-break. This helps prevent mental burnout and can bring out the creativity that is stunted in scrolling on a screen. The scheduling of breaks is most effective when you are prone to distraction or if your body naturally detaches itself from work and is signaling that it's time for a break. All in all, a break can vary whether it be a short walk, a moment spent doodling in a journal, breath work, or simply a stretching session. Allow yourself to thrive through incorporating breaks in your busy schedule, stress, or frustration throughout the day by acknowledging the beauty that is present. I hope you're ready to explore the challenges and successes that women's professional sports face today. This episode dissects issues of systemic abuse and racism in women's sport and speaks to recent events involving the National Women's Soccer League. Dr. Brown and Dr. Allison join us to share their research on the ins and outs of women's sports and the hope for a better future.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jill Nelson. I am a former Cal State East Bay women's soccer player here, and I'm about to graduate with my degree in kinesiology and a minor in business. And all my life, I have done things that I'm only passionate about, and social justice and change in everyone's community is something I've been passionate about for a really long time. So I'm a firm believer in that I can make sure that there's a better life or better opportunities for everyone else. So I hope people after me can do just that. So I'm very excited to introduce our guests. Here with us, we have Dr. Letisha E.C. Brown. Dr. Brown is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cincinnati. She uses Black feminism as a framework and methodology in her examination of issues of social inequality in the context of sports, media, education, and Black girlhood. We also have Dr. Rachel Allison joining us today. Dr. Allison is an associate professor of sociology at Mississippi State University. She is an author of the book Kicking Center: Gender and the Selling of Women's Professional Soccer. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. We have a lot to cover within this topic of women's sports, and I'm really excited to sit here and talk with you guys about it. But before we dive in, I would like to start with a quick icebreaker to get to know you guys. So I would like you guys to share where you guys are joining us from, who your favorite female athlete is, and one liner to add why you admire them.
Sure. Hi, Jill. Thanks so much for having me. I am Rachel Allison. I'm joining you today from Mississippi State University in the metropolis of Starkville, Mississippi. It is really difficult for me to think about one female athlete that I admire. But so I just picked one of the many women that I've admired in sports. And that is a woman whose name is Lucia, who was a college women's basketball player in the 1970s, who played for Delta State University here in Mississippi, where I live. She actually played for Delta State only in the fourth year of the program's existence. So she was really at the first wave of college women's basketball in this country. She won 3 college basketball titles with Delta State while playing in college. She also was the first woman to score points in Olympic women's basketball and was ultimately the first woman ever drafted into the NBA, although she did decline the opportunity at the time. And I find her so admirable as a talented athlete and really a groundbreaking woman of color in sport in this time where women had such a different landscape in terms of opportunity and recognition compared to today. And also because her story was told in a 2021 short documentary called The Queen of Basketball, which is available for free on YouTube.
Oh, that's a hard one to follow, Dr. Allison. Hi, I'm Dr. Letisha Brown. I am joining you all from Cincinnati, home of the University of Cincinnati. When I think about Black women athletes, there are just so many that I could choose from to say is my favorite. But when I think about a one-liner and my favorite Black woman athlete, I have to say hands down that it is I'm not the next Usain Bolt or Michael Phelps. I'm the first Simone Biles because Simone Biles is the queen of gymnastics and like at the forefront of ushering in this new wave of Black women in gymnastics on the national and international stage that we just haven't seen at this level. And Simone Biles with her 36 medals, 27 of which are gold, 5 of which are silver and 4 bronze, and the number of also skills that are just named after her. I think that she is such a role model for up and coming gymnasts and up and coming Black athletes in general. And I just also think she is a genuinely nice human, which I think is an incredibly amazing thing to maintain when you're forced with that much celebrity, especially at an early age.
100%. And especially for me, I dealt with mental health issues my whole 4 years here at East Bay, just trying to balance everything life, work, soccer, all of that. And for her to sit here on one of the biggest stages ever is something I admire. And I know so many other girls on my team, other girls that I know who play sports, admired her for that as well. After both of you ladies already discussed the great successes of your favorite female athletes, we're going to jump into the first question, which is what would success in women's sports look like to you? Dr. Allison, if you would like to speak first.
Sure. I think that's a great question and one that's really worth reflecting on. I think when I think about success in women's professional sports, I think about a lot of things, but particularly opportunity, leadership, resources, and recognition first and foremost. And all of these at the same time, not just in isolation from one another. So, opportunity certainly in professional sport, but also opportunity throughout the entire pipeline leading into professional sport. So, opportunity at lower levels, at the semi professional level, greater opportunities at the youth level leading into professional play, greater opportunities in the collegiate landscape, and so on. I also think about opportunities in leadership, especially for women, because there are so few women who have broken into positions of leadership and power in men's sport. I think women's sport is a space often where I hope to see more women. And so leadership is a really important place for success. And then resources and recognition, things like pay, things like support for health and injury prevention, but also recognition in a cultural sense, meaning media coverage for women's sports and other kinds of cultural valuation, right? So presence for women's sport. But at the same time, I also think that oftentimes we just define the success of women's pro sport as looking as much like men's pro sport as possible and measure the success of women's sport based on these supposed gaps between men and women. And I think that can sometimes be an appropriate framework or a starting point for those discussions, but I don't think that's where we should end, because I think that in some cases, when women's sport has been shut out of attaining similarity or equality on the same grounds as men, they've innovated. For instance, finding their own way to use social media creatively, to find their own ways to gain visibility and traction. And so I think it has to go beyond just seeing women's sport as successful only if it attains the male model of professional sport.
Again, that's such a great statement. And my sister actually works for the Los Angeles Lakers. She's in the front office. And my being a Mexican, her little self went and got it all. She is my biggest role model. And to see her just knock down every barrier. She is a person in the LGBTQ plus community as well. So seeing her break all those barriers and have all the women in their organization take the lead and say, hey, we're going to keep breaking these barriers is something I look forward to doing as I continue in my career and my studies. And again, another point to bring up to what you said is collegiate opportunities, the NILs. I think NILs have been so good for women athletes in college. It's let them build their own platforms. Like you said, the males use it as leverage to keep going and going to where women are finally making a stance and making a statement for themselves. So I appreciate your response. Dr. Brown, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I definitely agree with Dr. Allison, and I appreciate you, Jill, sharing your kind of like personal connection. When I think about success in women's sports, I'm often thinking about authenticity and representation, equity and inclusiveness. And I think so often, again, women's sports being compared to men's sports, and we lose the incredible contributions that women athletes have made that even male athletes have not. And so also just thinking about like how whenever we're talking about athlete activism, it's so easy to come up with names like Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and yet so very often we eliminate people like Wyoma Tyus, who was also at the 1968 Olympic Games, and during that games became the first American athlete, period, to win consecutive gold in the 100 meters after winning gold in Rome 4 years earlier. And so I think like having authentic representations of women with various racial identities and gender identities is super important towards the success of what it would mean to be a woman's athlete. And equity in terms of pay and resources. And I say equity rather than equality because all things being equal, women are already at a disadvantage. And so equality doesn't really help us unless we can be to a place where we're being paid equitably and treated equitably and having opportunities, not just in the sports themselves, but as sports journalists, as sports commentators, and being recognized for our knowledge and skill within these areas that is so often just like disconnected.
Yes. And speaking on women continue to break barriers and opportunities, I know in activism, the WNBA was a huge activist during COVID, and seeing how they came together for a bigger purpose only made their viewership go up. People actually wanted to pay attention. And it's unfortunate, but at the same time, they use their platform for something that's right. And then for the women's national team, for them to sit here and go to the Supreme Court and fight all of these cases just to sit here and have equal pay, even though they are the team that is winning, bringing home all the titles and all of that. Watching LFG was just infuriating. It made my blood boil, but it was like, you know what? Women use their platforms for something so much bigger than just the fame and the success. You guys for sharing that. But what are some of the biggest challenges in women's pro sports, or what are some things that they have faced?
I think this might come in part from my research on women's soccer, especially of all the professional sports that women are playing now. But I think a big challenge historically and right now has been health and safety of players, especially. I think we have seen a lot of cases where players' health and safety has not been prioritized, and where policies and procedures to protect players and resources devoted to health and safety are lacking. And this has got to be an enormous priority moving forward. And in part, then that challenge relates to a leadership vacuum, that there is not always appropriate leadership in women's sport. And if you look at the case of women's soccer, and even in other women's professional or semi-professional sports as well, it's often really so interesting to me to see how few women often are in leadership. And um, I think that's also maybe a part of this story. So certainly health and safety is the thing I would put first. I also think that sometimes there is a lower risk tolerance in professional women's sports compared to men. And so we often see things like lower upfront investments or automatic buy-ins to new men's professional or semi-professional leagues like arena football that we wouldn't see for similar women's sports, and kind of a faster time to withdraw if women's sports aren't immediately successful according to traditional metrics of sponsorship dollars and so on. And so that's one thing I've documented in some of my research, is just we don't always give women the same time to build and to grow in the way that we have for men's sport.
I agree. I know I have a few teammates who've gone to England to play. They go overseas, and the whole Brittney Griner, all of that whole situation just blew me away. I'm like, we're not going to do anything to sit here and provide anything for women here. And you get surprised when they go overseas and things happen. It's there's no opportunity here for us. So thank you for sharing, Dr. Allison. Dr. Brown, what do you think are some challenges that women's pro sports and semi-pro sports face?
Yeah, I again come back to this idea of representation. A lot of the work that I do is on media representations. And for women in sports, it's so often focused on physicality in terms of appearance and attractiveness. And even in thinking about like the lack of coverage of women's sports in the media, in print, in radio and television, and just how we need to be able to have women role models in sports seen up front for women and girls at an early age. And just the fact that kind of women's sports is built around this kind of like deficit narrative, right? So, like, women's sports exist because women aren't able to compete with the men. And we test for sex and gender because we're always concerned that there are men hiding out in women's sports where they can perceivably do better than the other people in the field. And it narrows our understanding of the fact that gender exists on a spectrum and that athleticism exists on a spectrum. Like, I would bet Simone Biles against any of the top male gymnasts anywhere, any day, anytime, without question. And like the same I would do for Venus and Serena Williams or Simone Manuel in the pool. Like, women compete. And just so often women are regulated to like the secondary athletic status, I think is something that remains a challenge even in 2023.
Yes, I actually had a classmate openly say in a discussion on equal pay, it's a business class, and he had the audacity to say, who even watches women's sports? Why would anyone fund this? Oh, there's four of us women athletes in that class. We all looked at each other. Blood was boiling. We were just wanting to cry out of frustration. And to sit here and just throw back at him and say, hey, it's about viewership. It's about sponsorships. It's about the opportunities we get. We don't have millions of dollars to pay women because we only have 4% of all of the broadcasting for games. So it's very unfortunate there still are some people, not just men. There's so many people who are just so narrow minded when it comes to looking at different things. And it does hurt me being an athlete, being a woman. And we fought for so many years to be in the position we are today. I don't know why. We still have to fight even harder for something as simple as sport. Yeah, very tough. But we're going to go a little bit deeper on some specific issues and events that we have been going on in the media. We're going to start talking about the National Women's Soccer League, the NWSL, intersectionality in women's sport, and the upcoming March Madness tournament for women's collegiate basketball. Dr. Allison, looking at women's pro soccer first, there have been some major developments in the last couple of years. But on the right side, we've seen some growth in attendance, investments, and visibility. Thank goodness. And at the same time, there has been a big reveal of major systemic abuse. Dr. Allison, I'll direct you to this first because I know this is a big focus for you in all of your research, and we appreciate women like you who look into stuff like this. But can you tell us a little bit more about it?
I think the NWSL is a really fascinating case study for understanding women's professional sports because, on the one hand, this is the longest lasting women's professional league in US history after two had previously folded after 3 seasons, whereas this one is now the first league to begin its second ever decade. And so I don't think there's any risk of immediate failure. And also we've seen team expansion. And so the league is not only adding new teams now, there are clear discussions for doing so in future years. And so we'll see more opportunity in the professional level and into the future. In addition, in the last year or two, the league has signed its first ever collective bargaining agreement with the NWSL Players Association, which is a huge step forward in expanding pay and expanding resources, and also in moving towards free agency, which I know is something that players have really wanted. And so we see all these kind of positive steps forward for the NWSL. But at the same time, in the last year or two, we have seen media reports, an internal NWSL investigation, and then a Department of Justice investigation that showed evidence of systemic abuses in the NWSL, ranging from sexual harassment to sexual abuse to coercion to systemic racism and retaliation within the league that had been going on for years, largely on the part of coaches, but also in some cases on the part of other managers or staff members within the NWSL. And this, I think, illustrates this kind of steps forward, but also serious like concerns and problems within this league that need to be addressed. And so I think we have to understand that this type of kind of systemic pattern of abuse is going to be possible in where there are large power differentials between groups of people. And in this case, there were huge power differences between players and coaches or management because players had for so long been paid very little, had little kind of job security, few resources. They could often be cut at any time. And so their entire livelihood, their ability to continue to play professionally depended on pleasing a few very powerful people who took advantage of that situation. And I think if we want to address the question of abuse in women's soccer, but also more broadly in women's sport and in sport more generally, we have to address power differentials. And we also have to consider that the NWSL had a lack of appropriate policies and procedures. There were no HR departments where complaints could be brought or could be seen through. There were no kind of, at the time, there were no actual anti-harassment policies. And so this was not actually a violation. And so we are starting to see change toward appropriate policies to protect players, but I think there's a ways to go. And I think the story of systemic abuses and corruption in sport is that anytime there is a lack of oversight and accountability outside of a league, right? Where leagues themselves are not left to police themselves, you're going to keep seeing this. And one thing I haven't really seen yet with the NWSL is an appropriate external system of accountability.
It sucks. It does a lot because as women athletes, especially, we're almost seen as robots or these people who can do crazy things in such a limited amount of time. And we're only seen just for our sport. We're not seen as human beings. We're not seen for who we are. We're not seen for where we come from. And it hurts me. And when all this stuff came out, I was like, I know those girls have sat quiet for so many years. And my sister has always told me, my mom always told me, people are terrified when a big group of strong women come forward about anything, because when women step forward on something, they're going to go get it. So I really have faith in our women's team, all of our soccer players, and every woman athlete across the nation, across other nations, and all of that, because when we keep going, we don't stop. We're going to fight for what's right.
Absolutely. And it's been so amazing to see women come forward and take these steps to create change. And at the same time, I hope for the future that we can create systems within sport that makes that less necessary, right, for women to fight that fight, where in some sense they can, right, just be athletes and not also advocates for things that should have been in place for them already.
100%. Yeah. We're on the right track, but like you said, it should have already been happened. It should have already developed. It should already have something in place for at least some restrictions, some rules, because for me, I've been privileged to been protected under the school. But if I was just on a semi-pro team, Title IX doesn't exist. Sexual harassment, all of those, like what sexual harassment means and having those definitions isn't on paper. It's just your interpretation. And it's unfortunate, but I'm really happy on the direction we're all going for this. But on a little brighter note, on a little happier note, the Women's World Cup is coming this summer. We've been waiting for this for 4 years. It's going to be hosted in Australia and New Zealand. And just let us know, what should we be looking forward to the most this summer?
One thing that we can look forward to this summer is a new expanded 32-team format. This will be the first Women's World Cup to see this many teams. And I think that's very exciting. It suggests there's growing parity in the women's game globally, but it also means that there are some women's teams that will have this opportunity to compete on this international stage for the first time. So I'm really looking forward to seeing this new tournament format. At the same time, I think that we also have to keep an eye on issues of gender and inequality, because already this tournament is bringing those to the forefront. For instance, in the last week or so, the Canadian women's soccer team threatened a strike and a boycott of a tournament here in the US, the She Believes Cup, because Canadian soccer had cut their budget in the 6 months leading up to the Women's World Cup, which meant they weren't able to hold training camps and training sessions. And that is, I think, one example of the way that the lead up until this tournament is really highlighting disparities in the women's game. In addition, several very well-known French women players have resigned from the national team in protest over treatment, mismanagement, and conditions on the national team. And a few days ago, the French Federation president stepped down from his position after kind of allegations of abuse and mismanagement. And I think that the Women's World Cup is a really interesting event because it can, in many ways, be celebratory. We're watching it because we love the soccer, we love the stories. And also, many of these stories are illustrations of continued inequality and disparity in the women's game. It illustrates a lot of these problems and brings them up.
I think the definition of the Women's World Cup this summer is going to be strength and grit for continuing to go through all the stuff they've gone through, but still put their cleats on, roll their shorts, put their hair up, and still do something that they love. But Dr. Brown, point of discussion that we want to bring to this conversation is going to be the intersectionality of gender, race, class, and sexuality in women's pro sports, especially in issues that concern racism, which are chronically underreported. Dr. Brown, can you speak to the intersectionality in women's sports and how this plays out?
Definitely. I am actually in the process of finishing up my first book called Say Her Name, Centering Black Feminism and Black Women in Sports, which is under advanced contract with Rutgers University Press. And in this book, I draw a lot from Black feminism, including intersectionality, which has its foundations in the early work of Anna Julia Cooper and then was coined by Kimberle Crenshaw and has been expanded upon by Black feminist sociologists like Patricia Hill Collins. And so I think a lot about the role of intersectionality in sports. And so we live in a society, not just here in the US, but globally, that is predominantly like in the West based in imperialism and white supremacy and racism that has an impact on sport as a microcosm of the larger social world. So here in the US, for instance, Black women are fighting against hair discrimination through things like the Dove's Crown Act. And it's reflective of the ways in which in recent years, Black women, especially in sports like aquatic sports, have been pushing for an inclusion of swim caps and other things that are created specifically for the texture of our hair. And I think that really speaks to how not all women's issues can be discussed as like singular and how we don't live single issue lives. So we can't tell single issue stories because our lives are structured by our position at the intersections of race, gender, class, and sexuality. And so it's important that we think about women in those various standpoints and how it impacts their kind of not only representation, but their lived experiences and realities. Earlier, you talked about Brittney Griner, who was detained in Russia for nearly 10 months. And we didn't even really hear about it in the US until she had been detained for weeks. And would this have been the same if she wasn't a Black queer woman? I don't think so. But it's so much easier to regulate Black queer women to the margins of our society that it took organizations like Black Feminist Future to really push for conversation around Brittney Griner and her pretty much unlawful detainment. And then when she came back, the narrative is like, how dare the US bring back this tall Black woman and leave military personnel behind? And that's not actually how global politics work, but kudos to you for suddenly being an expert in how the world of negotiations on the global stage like plays out. And I just think that we really need to be more attentive to paying attention to the differences, the different experiences that women athletes have as a result of their social location. And so when it comes to thinking about like solutions, like first we have to name the problem. We have to name racism and misogynoir, which is the specific form of anti-Black racism experienced by Black women in digital, social, and all forms of media, coined by Moya Bailey. We have to talk about the fact that when it comes to gender testing in sports, often the women that are targeted are Black African women or darker skinned women in general from the global South. And that is a problem because it leans back into these historical kind of constructions of womanhood and ideal womanhood as being exclusively white and all other forms of womanhood being aberrant. And we need to push back against that, but we can't do that unless we're willing to put a name to it. And I think that's what intersectionality offers is it gives us a frame of reference for understanding why these differential politics occur. And it also gives us a foundation for moving forward. And so I'm often inspired by the work, again, of Kimberle Crenshaw, who was one of the pioneers behind, for instance, the Say Her Name movement, which exists in order to bring attention to the often erased and marginalized stories of Black women who are victims of police violence and murder, and thinking about what it means, in fact, to be a woman and who is included when we're saying women. And when I say women, I'm talking about all who identify as women. I am talking about trans women. I am talking about cis women. I am talking about all women. And I think it's important that like we say that. And it's sad that we have to qualify that fact, but the reality is that we do because we know that Black women are targeted in ways that white women are. We know that Black queer women and Black trans women are especially targeted in ways that white trans and white non-gender conforming people experience. And so we have to talk about the fact that racism remains a huge issue in our society, just as sexism and homophobia and transphobia. And until we're willing to think about the nuances and how these experiences are held, not just in sport, but in society, we'll never see real social change.
Beautifully said. It does be like no matter where you are in our country, there's always communities, there's always certain groups of people, people who identify a certain way, like especially here in California, back where I'm from. There's a lot of people who are Hispanic, who come from all different Latin countries. And just see where the white supremacy happens, taking over on all of us wanting, and I say us because I do identify as a Mexican woman, we'll always take advantage of how we're going to work. We have a work ethic where we're just going to do whatever we can to sit here and provide for our family. And I think it goes a little too far sometimes where people take advantage of things that are just not worth it. There's a power struggle. We talked about it earlier with authority and people taking advantage of what their role is. And I think that does happen with no matter what they identify as, no matter what they claim to be, where they come from, it happens in every kind of setting. So thank you for speaking on that. I also wanted to ask you one more question. Have you seen any solutions to any of the issues that you mentioned?
Of course. I think that when women of color in particular are given opportunities to speak for themselves about themselves, we see kind of social change. For thinking about Naomi Osaka, who is often whitewashed in the media or faces backlash when she wants to talk about her Haitian roots. I think that the ways in which she has learned to control her own narrative insofar as saying things like that my father is from Haiti, even though I am from Japan, my mother's from Japan and I've grown up in the US, like I am still a Black woman who faces like Black challenges. And then also standing her ground when it comes to protecting her mental health. Like I think it's setting a precedent for other young women to do the same. And I think that having the opportunity to define themselves for themselves is part of moving toward a solution. I also think that it's important to really just pay attention and listen and amplify the voices. I don't like the idea of speaking for the silence. That's not your job. Your job is to create space for people to either have that voice themselves or to make clear that these people aren't silent because they want to be, but because of the politics that are in place that are keeping them silent. And to push back against those systems that are doing that is the work that needs to be done. But then I think about movements like brown girls do gymnastics or brown girls do ballet. And these are solutions. Like now Fisk University is the first HBCU in the US to have a gymnastics team. And that's because of the work that Black women have been doing on the ground as Black feminists, activists, as scholars, as women in general. And so I think that the solutions begin, for lack of a better phrase, like at home.
I do agree. Whatever happens at home, it projects onto everyone else and everyone else around you. To touch on both of your brilliant minds on what you said, I think representation and being able to see physically so many different types of women in all shapes, forms, colors, race, ethnicities, like sparks, no matter where you are at in this world, to step forward and keep going. Because I know so many young girls look up to Naomi just based off her and her cute little personality. She's not one to be in all of the limelight. So I think, again, you ladies both touched on it. Representation and being able to see that visibly and physically is a good step forward for all of us. So thank you guys both for speaking on all that you did. On to the next topic. March Madness begins on the 15th this month. Last year's tournament reflected some really big changes to the structure of the tournament. They came after a very viral video that went on TikTok from Sedona Prince. I was one of the women who shared it all over the place, and I cried after watching that video. She played for the University of Oregon, and she exposed the difference between men and women's training facilities during the March Madness tournament. The video sparked a significant list of changes that were decided by members of the Division I Women's Basketball Oversight Committee in August later that year. One big change that has been implemented in that is that the Women's NCAA Division I Women's Basketball Championship is finally allowed to use the March Madness slogan, which was previously trademarked exclusively for the men's tournament. Women's collegiate basketball viewership has been on the rise in recent years, and last year's 2022 tournament broke viewership records. Woohoo! Can each of you guys please speak onto the importance of gender equality or equity, not only in terms of training facilities, but also in terms of the business of marketing women's sports? Dr. Allison, would you like to speak first?
Sure, thank you. And so I think that it's very exciting that March Madness is coming up, especially given the kind of new context. This is what I think of as audience building, a concept from social scientists related to sport, that the entire history of men's sport, especially in commercialized fashion, has been a story of audience building, of systematically hyping up men's sport. And yes, we care about training facilities and resources, but we also care about promotion and marketing because we have an entire apparatus that exists to make disproportionately men's sports seem like it is exciting, like it is interesting, like it is competitive between teams, and that you should want to care about it and invest in it. And we haven't seen the same level of audience building for women's college sports historically, which is really interesting to me because promotions, marketing, videography, these are all areas that would fall under Title IX, right? So colleges and universities are supposed to be giving kind of equal attention to these areas, in addition to things like facilities, coaching, etc. And we haven't seen that. And I want all our listeners to consider that despite Title IX being a really land groundbreaking law that has had an effect on change for women in this country, especially in college sport, it does not have a lot of teeth to it. That we often think that, oh, if an entity is out of compliance, that bad things will happen, that there's something that happens to you. Whereas in reality, there isn't systematic oversight according to Title IX. There aren't a lot of clear, easy avenues to require compliance, even from colleges and universities. And so I'm not entirely surprised then that we have seen this.
And it's wild that after Sedona posted that video, I never knew. I just kept calling March Madness for both women and men. I was like, oh, I'm so excited for March Madness. I'm so excited. Who's doing the brackets? Like my stepdad does all of that, and I get excited to see. And I just only brought to my attention that I've just been so accustomed to saying it's equal. Both of them have the same name, and it broke me a little bit of, wow, the reality is that it's not going to be like that. And you see the comparison of the hype videos you discussed on that is all the March Madness videos. You have the edits, the different kind of splashes when they make a basket. You have the different titles and the different artists coming on with it, and it's just a little 15-second. It's like, okay, cool, women's tournament next. And it all made sense to me when Sedona posted that video. So thank you for sharing that, Dr. Allison. Dr. Brown?
Yeah, just to build off what Dr. Allison is saying, it's hard to watch women's sports if you can't watch women's sports. If you're not filming women's sports, how are people going to watch women's sports? If you're not advertising that women's sports are playing at a certain time, how are we going to watch women's sports? I know so much about when men's events are happening, and yet so much less about what happens to women in sports, specifically at the collegiate level. Even on campuses, you can see the difference in who's hyped up and who isn't. And I think that we need to do better about promoting women's sports and, like you said, making it something that is read as readily athletic and competitive, and not just this kind of, oh, no men's teams are playing, so I guess I'll watch, because that's the narrative that people have in their mind. But women's sports, I think, in my opinion, and are often more entertaining than men's sports because they have to be, because they don't have the luxury of being the default category. So I think we just need more marketing and it makes more money for everybody. And since we live in a capitalist society, it shouldn't, if we give the money to women's sports, we can see what successes they will be.
I think that's why men's sports sometimes use all the graphics, the crazy designs, and extra music to hype up of what really is going on in the game. Because I do get bored, I'm not gonna lie, during the men's basketball. To where women's games, like you have to wait till the fourth quarter before it gets really intense. Like you want to watch every second of that game. But to also, you talked about media, Dr. Brown. So I wanted to ask you, do you believe the NCAA and the media are doing enough, or any thoughts on what needs to happen to continue to grow the women's sports platform?
Yeah, I would definitely say no, they're not doing enough, but who is really doing enough? I think that our media is very skewed in kind of the directionality of who is seen as the dominant force within our society. And we need to do better about promoting women's sports beyond just, oh, look at how cute these girls are in these outfits. Let's go watch them play. We need to talk about women athletes as though they are athletes and not just as though they are women, because those two things are not mutually exclusive. And I think we also just need the NCAA to support their women's team with the same amount of vigor that they support their men's team. And perhaps even more, talking about and trying to have these recovery narratives of male athletes who get in trouble for sexual assault and other things, when you could just be paying attention to the excellent efforts that women are putting into their sports and the activism that they've been doing consistently for generations. Like, it's just, I don't understand, but you would rather pour your resources into this one kid who has shown that they are really like undeserving of the mantle of being a college athlete. If you're going to be out there sexually assaulting women, I don't care who you are, you shouldn't be playing athletics at the collegiate or even at the professional level. But we see where our priorities are when we see who the media puts up. And if we want, especially now in Women's History Month in March, if we want women to be front and center, then we need to make them front and center.
I do agree. I know there's a team out there who they did some things and they're still able to step on that court and play a game. But the double standard with women's sports, we roll our shorts too many times, or we lash out in a grocery store because someone took something from us, or we get in a little car accident and someone records it and they got the wrong end of it. Like we're benched, we're suspended for a couple of games, we're kicked off the team, or we're put on some type of probation. So it's very difficult. The next question that I kind of want to talk about is just the different growth or the different outlets and the growth of professional opportunities for women and athletes. There's the Athletic Athletes United, the new USL Women's League in soccer. I know NIL deals. I don't know if it really ties into it, but it's another opportunity for women at the collegiate level. Anything like that. If you have any other opportunities that you know about, please share and your thoughts on the new opportunities for women.
So first, you mentioned name, image, likeness. And so I want to comment on that briefly because I think it's new and it's also really important. On the one hand, we could think of that as new opportunities for women athletes, and that's certainly the case. But at the same time, I want to be a little cautious because I think we've actually seen NIL as a space where gender equality has become apparent as well, because I think there is emerging evidence that women athletes often have larger and more engaged social media followings, for instance, but are not capitalizing on that in terms of a financial return through NIL, the same way that some male athletes are. So they're actually not getting the value they're bringing to social media platforms, for instance. And so in general, I also feel a little skeptical of the idea that the name, image, likeness is truly getting college athletes the value of their labor, because their labor is often in their sport. And so sometimes I think that NIL is really just asking athletes to go above and beyond and do more work to get any money versus giving them the money that they've already earned through the labor they do in their sport. And so NIL is definitely complicated, but beyond that, we have seen growing opportunity, new leagues and kind of new expansions of positions in semi-professional and professional sport. And if we care about things like opportunity, right, to continue in a sport after college, especially, this is great. I think there's so many talented women, I think, who have faced the end of their career when they graduate from college, when that may not be the case and may not be what they want. And in a sense, expanding opportunity is absolutely fantastic. I also have some concerns about what this has meant, or what this has meant to see growing opportunity in women's professional sport in terms of what happens lower down the pipeline, especially in terms of youth sport. And so I think about the case of soccer and specifically the pipeline into competitive women's soccer largely happens through the private club system. And so the expansion of the end of that pipeline at the professional level is going to mean largely a ramping up of the youth club system, because it needs to produce more players to meet this demand. And the club system has some problems. The club system, on the one hand, is really expensive, and it ends up pricing a lot of young women out whose talent otherwise would allow them to shine. That's absolutely the case for poor and working class girls, and who are disproportionately girls of color. And so we're also operating this system at a lower level that's going to shut a lot of people out. And it is centered around high levels of competitiveness and very early specialization in the sport, which research suggests leads to a lot more problems with injury in youth sport, and is not necessarily the best if we think about girls from a holistic perspective in terms of their development as a person as well as an athlete. And so if we see the system ramp up at a youth level in order to get more girls into the competitive pipeline later on, I don't know that's necessarily a good thing for all young women. And I also think we're seeing a slow but growing trend of young women being recruited for elite level soccer at younger and younger ages. This has already been true at Division I college level, where girls may be recruited in middle school to play for college teams. Just last week, the NWSL announced it signed its youngest ever player at the age of 15 to a professional contract. And I certainly have nothing to say about this young woman, who's incredibly talented and absolutely deserves everything that she's getting in terms of her NWSL success. And at the same time, I think there are some real questions to ask about what it means to have young teenagers competing with women who are up to twice their age, and who in many ways may be uniquely vulnerable. So I think just some good food for thought as we think about expanding the professional level.
I do agree. You talked about club. Growing up, my mom worked so hard just to make sure that, I don't want to cry, but my mom worked so hard to make sure that I was doing something that kept me out of trouble, doing something that I loved. And she never stopped. And no matter if that meant, I played on 3 teams in high school. I played on 2 years older, a year older, and then my age. And my mom did everything she could to make sure that I was driving up and down to Davis. I had food to eat. If she didn't eat, if you need to eat, you have to fuel for your next game. Or, hey, we're going to stay at this hotel, like, because everyone else is staying at this hotel. And it broke me to hear that my mom was like, oh, we have to do this because everyone else is doing it. But she didn't want me to see her struggle. And I understood, and I knew, and I appreciate it. And that's something I will never, ever take for granted, because it is hard for the poor and working class to sit here and keep up with all this demand, because you see all these opportunities are targeted for the people who can afford it, targeted for people who are in upper classes who can sit here and take these flights across countries, can go to different states, travel hours and hours. And you forget about the people who really come out from stuff that's not all like that. We come out from the mud. That's what I say. And you really have to work and get for it, or get to it. And I will never take for granted, like I said, everything my mom did just to sit here and make sure I was good, I was taken care of, and I continue to do what I love, no matter how much it stressed her out. So shout out to my mom. Dr. Brown, would you like to touch on anything?
I think that you both really covered it. Like, I think that expansion is great, but we also have to think about what expansion means, because expansion isn't equally distributed and access isn't equally distributed. And even just thinking about like differentials in NIL in terms of division. So NCACA, Division I, Division II, and just thinking about like how resources are segmented due to not only geography, but just like politics and class. But there are opportunities, and there are growing like vehicles for representation. And again, I always want to hype up brown girls do ballet and brown girls do gymnastics, because like when I was growing up, like there was Betty Okino and Dominique Dawes, but that was it. And if you were lucky, you knew Betty Okino, because people forget that it was both her and Dominique Dawes at the 1992 Olympic Games that were the first on the U.S. national team. We remember Dominique Dawes because she went to 3 Olympics back to back, forever ago in my mind. But I just think that it's important that we think about the ways in which these benefits are segmented.
Being a Division II athlete, I never wanted to go D1. It was just something that scared me. If I had an issue, it probably would have been just thrown under the rug and said, deal with it, go ahead. I did have some instances here where I spoke up about my mental health and it was shot down, but it wasn't in a sense of what I felt it would be at a higher level. And to see the differences between my friends who gone on and played D1, my boyfriend plays D1 football, and seeing all the luxuries that they have that I don't, it's crazy to see the difference. And even going lower to a D3, everyone has to bus like to 6, 7, 8, 9 hour destinations, to where I'm lucky enough to fly to LA, lucky enough to fly to Arizona, Nevada. And those are the little wins that I do appreciate and I never take for granted. So thank you both for sharing on that. We're going to wrap up this podcast. We're getting a little close to time, but our last question and little topic of discussion is talking about Kim Turner. She was featured on our last season in our gender equity episode, which was episode 11 of this podcast. So speaking to allyship, she brought up that sports require men to be a part of the equation, not just women. Striving for gender equity requires the work of everyone together, allying for each other and for others who do not have a voice. Allyship is not just reading one article. It is day in and day out of being there at the table. We are so honored to have had Kim Turner chime in on this last season. So now we would like to frame a similar question. What are some ways that people out here listening can support women's sports, and what are the resources they have that they can do, groups to follow, donate, or any action steps that anyone listening can take?
I would say, as a way to support women's sports, is like to support the women athletes that you know, first and foremost. Go to your little sister's games and hype her up as much as you would your little brother. Be sure that you're cognizant of the challenges that people who play in women's sports face. Think about how you can donate to grassroots organizations that are making a way for athletes to train and to play. I currently know a young woman who is competing in winter sports in the skeleton, and she's one of the few Black women on that team, and she has 0 sponsorship. And it's ridiculous because she's won several events and she's on the national team, and she could be great if she had the resources in order to keep going. And like, she's going without resources. And I just think that is unthinkable. And if you're able to help support young athletes in training and young women athletes in training, I think that we can contribute to, again, like Brown Girls Do Ballet, Brown Girls Do Gymnastics. There's also like Black Feminist Futures, which is a social justice organization that did so much on the ground work to bring Brittney Griner home. Every day I was concerned for her safety. Like, it's hard enough to be a Black woman and for her to be a Black queer woman in the US, let alone in a country like Russia, where they have even harsher pejorative laws against people that identify as LGBTQAI. And it's just like, women athletes shouldn't be in a position where they have to play overseas in order to supplement their income and then get trapped and be left to the wolves. That shouldn't be a thing that happens. Athletes, period, shouldn't be used as political pawns in these larger games of geopolitics. That is not their lane. That is not their role. I also think, like, read and learn more about the experiences of women in sports, like Rachel Allison's book, my forthcoming book. There are women that are writing about these issues in books, in blogs, all sorts of spaces. And we really just need those voices to be amplified. So thank you for creating like this space to do just that.
I absolutely agree with everything that Dr. Brown just said. I think at the professional level, you can watch, follow, listen. You can watch women's sports. You can watch them locally in your town and on your college campus. You can watch them on TV in many cases. You can follow athletes on social media, athletes themselves, often as they tell their own stories. You can listen to podcasts like this one, other podcasts and kind of media productions about women's sport. If you have the ability to give, you can also often donate not just to women's leagues or women's teams, but specifically to women's players associations. And those are often the entities that are really moving the rights and resources for women athletes forward in important ways. So you can donate not only to the NWSL Players Association in women's soccer, but also to the Black Women's Players Collective in the NWSL that's doing incredibly important work. In some cases, it's players associations rather than teams or leagues that have licensed their image or their names for merchandise. And for instance, in women's soccer, you can buy merchandise through the website Breaking Tea, and those contributions will go financially to the Players Association and not necessarily the NWSL. Also, shout out to Lynn Williams and Sam Mewis, who have a fantastic women's soccer podcast called Snacks, highly recommended. And lastly, I would encourage everyone listening to look for ways that they can seek out and support independent journalists who are covering women's sport, because women's sport has so often been shut out of kind of mainstream traditional outlets. That doesn't mean there are people who haven't been doing this work often for a very long time, but they are unrecognized often, or under-recognized and underfunded. And so look for those people, especially through social media sites like Twitter and Instagram, because they're there and they're doing the work. Listen to them, subscribe to their Substacks, their newsletters. If you send me a message on Twitter, I can tell you who the women's soccer ones are, but there are people all over this country who are putting the work in to cover women's sport in really unique ways. And so find those people and support them, because they're telling some incredibly important stories.
Dr. Brown, would you like to talk about the Black Girl Hockey Club?
Oh yeah, Black Girl Hockey Club is another one of those like organizations that I would say support, and especially because we don't really hear about like hockey and women, and let alone Black women in hockey. So I just want to give that shout out. I also want to shout out the skeleton player that I was talking about, Mystique Ro, who is a phenomenal player from Nocasville, Virginia, and who is out there being a representative of the Black Asian community, just kicking butt in winter sports. And if you can support her and all of her work, I think she is an excellent kind of like role model and example of what representation can mean in these spaces where we don't expect to see these certain faces. Like we're getting people like Star Andrews in figure skating, who was a Black woman, who we haven't really seen the likes of since like Surya Bonali, and all of the controversy that went around her career. Like Black women athletes matter. I'm particularly passionate about the experiences of Black women and girls, but I love all women athletes and all women of color athletes and all women of all sexual identities. And I think that it's time, and it's past time, that we do better.
Yes, it is about time we do better. And hearing both of you guys really talk about stuff like this and be so passionate, you can hear it in your guys' voices. It makes me feel good inside. It makes me feel like there's people actually who care. And it's not just here in our community, it's people in different states. It's people all over the world that are continuing this fight for women like me, even though I'm in my transition of life after soccer, after my collegiate sport. And I just want to thank you guys one more time for giving your guys' time as well to this podcast and to me. So we'll link all the references in the show notes for anyone who wants to follow up with any of them, any of their books, any of their links they shared. It will be in the show notes. So thank you guys so much for joining us today on this podcast of Pro Women Sports on Making Moves. And again, continue to educate yourself, push forward in the right direction for a better place for not only yourself and the people around you, but for the people coming after. So thank you guys again, and talk soon.
This podcast was brought to you by the Center for Sport and Social Justice at Cal State University East Bay. It was produced by McKenna Duda with technical and promotional support from Angelo Sunier, Virginia Ard, Jill Nelson, Sienna Clark, and Alex Salveson. Their music is by Marby Miller. A big thank you to Center for Sport and Social Justice co-directors Dr. Matthew Atencio and Dr. Missy Wright for their support. Funding for Making Moves was provided by Cal State University East Bay and the Center for Sport and Social Justice. Make sure to catch all 6 episodes of Making Moves, streaming now on SoundCloud, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.